The other day, I had a son and a daughter of a federal employee who was referred to us years ago enter, come in our office. And this is the reason why we're having this webinar today, because one of the things with TSP is they have some of the most antiquated inheritance rules. Just because before the TSP Modernization Act, there wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of innovation that went into TSP. You got five funds, you got life cycle funds, but the inheritance aspect of TSP still has not been modernized. So the other day, we had a son and a daughter come in of a guy. He was referred to us. He didn't end up doing anything with us, but he was referred to us by a client of ours. And his kids were reminded to come and talk to us because they ran into an issue that a lot of you will run into if you don't have the proper uh, mechanisms in place, like estate plans, rollover IRAs, traditional IRAs, Roth IRAs. If you don't have those things in place, the thing with TSP is TSP has a 90-day rule, right? And they're one of the very few retirement plans left that still has this 90-day. We had a client that came into we not a client, but we had a son and a daughter that came in. Their dad worked for the government 30 years, and this is one of those situations where if you're not understanding how things work, it could be detrimental, right? And so again, he was referred to us years ago by a coworker of his. He didn't end up doing anything with us, just for a variety of reasons. But he passed away about a year ago, and his kids came into our office. And when his kids came into our office, the issue they had was TSP has sent them a check because if you have your kids as beneficiaries on your TSP and you pass, they have 90 days. TSP will reach out to them if they're the beneficiaries, and you have 90 days to take. They have, well, not you, but they have 90 days to take that money and put it into their own IRA, right? And I've talked a lot about the Secure Act and the 10-year rule and things like that on these calls, but I never really talked about this TSP inheritance rule. This TSP inheritance rule says this: if you don't take your money out of the TSP, if your kids don't take your money out of the TSP within the first 90 days, and what they'll do is they'll send them a lump sum check where they take out the 20%, the customary 20% that the TSP has, and they'll give you those. They'll send your kids that check. And so what that does is that causes all types of tax problems if your kids don't know what to do with the money. And in this case, the kids didn't know what to do with the money, right? You get your parent. You're already grieving the loss of your parent. Um, the money comes to you, this big lump sum of money, but the tax is already taken out. What do you do next, right? And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is what you can do ahead of time to prepare your kids. Again, this doesn't apply to if this money goes to your spouse. It only applies if this money goes to your kids, which a lot of people are in that situation, right? And so you want to be prepared because unlike most 401ks, they will either allow, like if you have a 401k with Charles Schwab or JP Morgan and one of those TIA CREF, the kids can just open up an account with them and they'll walk you through, just open up another account with them, keep the money in an IRA, and you go on about your merry business, your merry business, right? But with TSP, it's not like that. With TSP, they will send you the check, take the taxes out, and then your kids are left with this big chunk of money, taxes already taken out. It can cause an issue. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through those steps that your kids can get. Well, two things. We're going to walk through the steps of what your kids can do, and then what you can do while you're still here, so your kids don't run into that situation, right? Because again, as a federal employee, you have a lot going on. You got a pension that your kids aren't going to get the pension, but your spouse will, no survivor, or if you have a special needs child, they'll get the pension. But your TSP is one of those things that, and I know I talk a lot about taxes because taxes, as I mentioned plenty times, taxes is going to make or break your inheritance to your kids. And if also you when you get into your mid 70s, right? And so if you don't have a tax plan, you could be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table. This is why I talk about it so much, because those that have a plan, it makes a huge difference. I was talking to a guy recently. He just retired. You know, he had a little under $1 million in his TSP, and his plan is at Christmas this year he's going to take 100,000 for all three of his kids. He has just 100,000 period. He's taking 100,000, and he's going to hand deliver each one of his children the money to pay off their student loans, right? because he had a tax strategy in place, right? He's taking it from his Roth IRA. He's going to hand them each a check on Christmas and say, your student loans are paid off, right? When you have a tax strategy in place, this is the type of stuff that you can do that makes a big difference. On the reverse, though, if you don't, the conversation that I had with these two kids are the type of conversation that your kids can have. And you work long and hard. You want to make sure your money's going to your kids, right? Because here's the thing. As a federal employee, as I mentioned many times, your TSP is not something that you're going to be using for income like people that are in the private industry. People in the private industry, they're using their TSP. They're using their 401k on a monthly basis to solve a bunch of problems. It's paying their income, it's their travel fund, it's their long-term care strategy, it's their family emergency strategy. That 401k is active in the lives of our clients who don't have a pension. But as a federal employee, you have a very generous pension. You have a solid TSP plan. And so your TSP is going to continue to grow. And so because your TSP is continue to grow, because it continues to grow, when you pass on, people are after that money. The people after that money is the IRS is coming for that money. The people think when the IRS pushed the RMDs back from 72 to 74, that was like to give you more time to pay taxes. No, that was to give you more time to grow your money, so that if you have, let's use this case for example, if you have 800,000, you have 2 years, your TSP is growing, you haven't paid taxes, the taxes are deferred. Now in 2 years, that 800,000 might be 850. Now it's time for the IRS to get their money. They're going to get a piece of the 850 instead of the 800, right? And then every year so forth after that. And so the thing you have to do is you have to be proactive, right? And this is something that we're always talking about, is being proactive in your tax strategy, because at the end of the day, right now the IRS can set, based on however Congress votes, how much taxes are going to be taken out. Right now you're just deferring the taxes, but the IRS is still a silent partner. So in this situation with these two children, well, they're adults, but the descendants of this guy, his beneficiaries, because they didn't have a plan, the IRS had a plan for their money, right? And so, this guy worked 30 years in the government, 800,000 in this TSP, left the money to his two adult children. Very proud of that, right? Very proud of that. But a lot of people, they didn't have real conversations around money. And so when the money got, and they're busy adults, raising kids. And so when they got the money, they're thinking, okay, dad left us this money, which he did, but he didn't understand how to control it, right? But at the end of the day, if you lack knowledge, the people with the knowledge are going to come and take the money, right? And so these rules are set up for that, right? And so this guy, 30 years, left both his children 50-50, assumed like, okay, I'm going to leave my kids 400,000 a piece, and that's it. But because they didn't understand the rules, things got kind of messed up. So in this situation, the 90 days, they received the check. 20% taxes were taken out automatically from TSP. That's an automatic TSP rule. It doesn't matter what your tax bracket is. TSP is going to take 20% out, right? Then on top of that, both of these individuals are higher earning individuals, married. And so that automatically put both of them into the 32% tax bracket, right? Again, they didn't know what they were doing, right? So they just walked into the situation. All of a sudden, now they're realizing that they're in the 32% tax bracket because of the amount of money they have. Now, instead of, 160,000, now they owe 256,000 total in their IRS bill automatically, right? Just because they did not have a strategy. And I can't stress this enough, right? If you don't have a strategy, it can come back to bite you. So this is why at least once a month on these webinars, I'm always talking about taxes, because again, and it's very obvious with the type of president we have in office right now, taxes are a big deal to people like that, right? And so you want to understand how to play the rules like they play the rules so you can benefit. And so like in 2019, I talk about this all the time, the Secure Act got passed, and the Secure Act got passed. Well, within the Secure Act, the Secure Act dealt with a whole bunch of other stuff, but within the Secure Act, this 10-year rule got put in there, and that 10-year rule was targeting middle-class people, right? Because middle-class people before 2019, you could, if you didn't have a certain wealth threshold, you can use what's called a stretch IRA, and you could push out if you left money to your kids or your parents left money to you, you had until you turned 72 to be able to start withdrawing money from that account and not be charged the RMDs. That stopped in 2019. Now in 2019, if your parents are still alive and they have money in an IRA or a 401k or something like that, you have, as soon as they pass, you have 10 years from then to withdraw all that money and put it in your name. What that does, is that puts you in a higher tax bracket now, because if your parents leave you $1 million, hopefully they do, right? Every year now you got to take $100,000 out of that account and put it into your name, right? And what that does is if you already make 150, now you're at 250, right? Which can put you in another tax bracket. If you're married, even higher, right? And so what that does is that benefits the IRS, right? And so now, before, the only people that were talking about estate taxes and how that's a thing for them was rich folks, right? Now, middle class folks are under not attack, but just are targeted for that tax revenue. And it's a big line item for a lot of people, right? And so this was passed in 2019. The education hasn't been out there long enough for people to really embody it and start using it. But this is a big thing, right? And so what you want to do is you want to be proactive in making sure that you have a tax strategy in place so that you're not just giving your money to the IRS. You want the majority of your money coming to your kids, right? And so, just because they didn't have a strategy, now they're looking at a $256,000 net loss just because they didn't have a strategy. So what we're going to do today is talk about what they could have done to prevent that and what you can do to prevent that, right? And so what you want to do is you want to start thinking about strategic rollovers, right? And what that means is Roth conversion. That term is being talked about more and more as a direct, as relating directly to the Secure Act 10-year rule, right? Before that, you wasn't hearing a whole lot about strategic rollovers because the urgency wasn't there. But now the urgency is there because you want to make sure you move your money from a traditional account to a Roth IRA, or from, as soon as you retire. Like, it's important to do it then. And the reason why that is because when you retire, you're in the lower tax bracket, right? So if their dad had moved the money to a traditional IRA, so they're moving some of that money to a Roth IRA, he would have paid the taxes at a lower tax bracket than what he was when he was working, and at a much lower tax bracket than what his kids are now having to pay at, right? Nowhere close to 32%. And that would have put hundreds of thousands of dollars back in their pocket, right? And so that's one of the things that we do with Fed Legacy when we take you through our TSP finish line process. We of course we go over your income strategy for your FERS pension. We go over your Social Security strategy, making sure you take Social Security at the right age, making sure you understand that, making sure your bills are aligned. Because what we want you to do is we want to make sure that when you retire, as we're preparing you towards retirement, that at minimum your FERS pension, your Social Security, at least those pay your bills, right? And we'll talk through your expense plan and things like that. What that allows you to do is allows your TSP to grow. If that and grow, and then you could do the fun stuff with your TSP. You could we have clients who they invest in a lot of travel, invest in real estate, they invest in a whole host of things. They make sure you take care of your long-term care needs, things like that, with your TSP, right? But you want to make sure your FERS pension and your Social Security at least cover the bills, right? But what that also allows you to do is it also allows you to start doing some of those Roth conversion strategies with your TSP at an earlier age, at a younger age, before you get to that 74 time period where you're now forced to do it. And if you're forced to do it at that age with the large TSP balance, then that's exactly what the IRS wants you to do. Because at that point, now you have all this money, traditional money, and then that'll get more, right? And so you want to do it on your terms where you pay it at a lower rate, and then your kids will not have to deal with what they had to deal with, right? And so again, TSP rollover IRA, right? Super important. And if you don't do that, you want to make sure you educate your kids. Like, look, you got 90 days. If I pass, right? And again, I always talk about the reason why I started Fed Legacy was because when I was at the University of Maryland, I wasn't having conversations like this in high school. But when I got to the University of Maryland, a lot of the kids I started hanging out with, just in my economics and statistics classes, they knew a lot more than I did, right? Because their families have been talking about this stuff for years and years and years, right? And it was ingrained in them. And so, what you if you don't move the money, you want to make sure that you have the conversation with your kids, like, all right, if I pass, you got 90 days to move this. So make sure you have some type of IRA already open that you can move this money to in a strategic way, so you're not forced to pay this big TSP tax, this 20% tax right away, right? You want to do it with strategy, right? And so make sure you have that rollover IRA already open. It eliminates that 90-day deadline trap where they're forced to pay that 20% right then. Again, you want to make sure they do it on their terms. Super, super important. That's something that we make sure you have set up by working with us. This family didn't have it, but you want to make sure you have that set up so that your kids have they have some place to take that money the minute you pass, right? And have that conversation, right? And then once that money's in a traditional IRA, in the first 5 years after you retire, right? Because in that first 5 years when you retire, well, a couple things happen, especially right now. Right now, tax rates are lower than they were, 7 years ago, right? Taxes are lower than they were then. And they just passed the new tax laws where it keeps the taxes pretty low, right? But then, when you have taxes low, taxes tend to rise because, again, you got to pay back the economy has to pay back the debt, things like that. But those things, me and you, we can't control it. But right now, taxes are lower than they were 7, 8 years ago. That's a fact, right? And we know they're going to be that way for at least the next 4 years, right? And so with that being the case, you want to make sure, especially if you're retiring in the next year or so, you want to make sure you start doing Roth conversions so you pay that tax now. And I like to say, right now the IRS is a business partner of yours, and they have their cut, you have your cut, right? And their cut is determined by who's in office a lot of times. And so right now we know what their cut is. We know what it is, right? And so now that we know what it is, it's best, especially if you retire next 5 years, to make sure you pay those taxes at this current rate, right? Because once it's paid, they're out of your business, right? They're totally out of your business. The guy I mentioned earlier, who's handing the checks to his kids, we've been talking to him now for about 4 years or so. And so we helped prepare him for this place. And now because he was prepared, now he can hand those checks out because the taxes are already paid on that stuff, right? And so that's where you want to be. You want to be in a position where the IRS is no longer in your business, right? That 90-day rule wouldn't even apply to you because the taxes are already paid, right? Now, your kids will have to take the money out of the TSP at that point. But if it's in the Roth TSP, there's no taxes, so it doesn't even matter. Right? The goal, if you talk to any most wealthy people, right, their whole thing, their focus, majority of their conversation is estate planning and taxes, right? That's what they're always talking about. It's how do I minimize my taxes, right? We see it on the news, right? Wealthy people are always talking about this stuff. And this is why I'm driving it home in these conversations because, over the last couple of years, especially since 2019, we're seeing in our software when we're doing these tax conversions, we're having these tax conversations, you see the biggest shift when you start paying the taxes early. Because here's the thing that's going to happen. When you retire, your money's going to continue to compound. We've seen clients who, one lady, she had, when she retired, she had $960,000 in her TSP. And now that $960,000 overall. Actually, we have different IRAs now, but she had $960,000 overall. And now that money has grown and she retired into 2022. She had $960,000. Now she's at around $1.2 million. And she's retired. She's been retired. Her money's just been growing. But because we're doing these Roth conversion strategies, that as that money grows, the taxes aren't as big because we're paying the taxes now. But if we would have let that money continue to grow non-tax, she would run into a tax situation once she gets 74, where that money's, hopefully is in the 1.8, 1.9 because of the compounded interest over time, right? And so the goal, again, you want to make sure that if you work this hard for this money, that when your kids do receive the money, or if you're in your 80s and you have a long-term care issue, that money goes to you, not you being in a long-term care situation where we run into clients who they want to move into senior living facilities that are like the best in their area, right? And they might need to put a big down payment down, so they got to take money out of their TSP to do that. Or they run into a health issue and they want to pay the best home health care person, or whatever the reason is, where you're forced to now take a whole lot of money out, or your grandkids going to college and you want to be the person that just says, you know what, Jermaine, I'm gonna pay, I'm gonna pay your college off. You don't want to be calling somebody like myself or calling TSP and seeing what the tax implications are. You want to be able to just write that check and not thinking nothing of it. And so the way to do that is when you retire to start having tax conversations early, right? So that when that time does come, you have complete control, right? And you're not like the son and daughter that came into our office and just were confused, right? And I felt bad for me. I wasn't even going to do this conversation today, but it was just so urgent to me that I'm like, I just don't want to see any more people like that, because the information, you need to have this information. And the TSP inheritance rules are just really antiquated. They're one of the last 401k programs out that still has that 90-day rule in it, right? And so, again, the path they had, 800,000, tax rate 32 plus, now they're left with 544,000. If you do it right, because you still got to pay taxes, but you pay taxes on your terms. You do it right, and I average, just depends on where you are. But in most cases, most federal employees we run into have an effective tax rate of around 15% when they first retire. That's 680,000. That's about 136,000 saved just in that, just with those type of strategies. We're not talking about what that looks like 20 years from now with compounded interest on that money. Where this 136 number is a lot bigger, right? But again, having a strategy is super important, right? And so, we've been doing this now 16 years. This tax stuff hasn't been the big topic of conversation before 2019. It really wasn't it wasn't really a conversation at all, really, because we would talk about RMDs and things like that, but you can kind of push that stuff off. But now with the Secure Act, it's a really big deal, right? And so, I just wanted to go through that today with you guys. Again, strategic planning doesn't take much time, will make a huge difference in your trajectory, not only for yourself, but just your family legacy. And that's one thing that I've been talking to a lot of our clients about right now, especially with everything going on with the new administration and everything they got going on. This is the time for people in our culture to really create, and this word is used a lot, generational wealth, but I really mean it. Like, I've talked to clients all the time who have more money in their TSP than they know what to do. And I'm just being honest. I was talking to a lady yesterday. She had 1.3 million in her TSP, and she's just like, I don't even know what to do with all this. And that's a conversation I have a lot, right? And so we just talked about like foundations, businesses with the nieces and nephews and kids, real estate that you can buy. Like, there's a lot of things you could do if you plan properly. And she had planned properly. She mentioned that when she first started in the government, one of her older supervisors told her put her money in the C fund, keep adding to it every year. Something I talk about all the time. And she never really looked at it until it was time to retire, and not even time to retire, when this new administration came in and there was all this fear at the beginning of the year. And then she realized how much she had. She knew she had a decent amount, but she didn't realize until talking to us when it came to her pension, her Social Security, plus this TSP. And she realized she didn't even need it. And I was just showing her like, well, as this is going to continue to grow, and we were just looking at her statements, and she's like, wow, I didn't realize that it was growing at such a fast rate, and I don't even know what to do with all this. And it continues to grow in retirement. And so, like I told her, I'm just like, hey, you just got to, your main thing is, how do I get the IRS out of it? And then at that point, it's like, all right, now how do I plan for myself long-term, right? Long-term care is super important, right? If you don't have it, that's fine. You can use your TSP to fund your long-term care. But how do you create something that lasts beyond you for your family? Because we don't know if these jobs will ever come back, right? But one thing that you can do is, with this opportunity that you have, and you all have a really good benefit package, is you can become someone that creates jobs within your family, right? This is how we have to start thinking. And this is how I'm thinking when I'm talking to clients now. It's like, how can you take this that you have and put it to good use within your family, right? Within your community, right? And and not give money to the IRS because you just don't know. Hundreds of thousands of dollars mean a lot. That money should stay in your pocket, right? And that's something I'm very, 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 very passionate about. One, with this out of the company, also with clients, right? So I'm gonna stop there. If you want to have a situation, sit down with us, to help build out a blueprint for you. Just put blueprint in the chat.